I just quickly
Well, good evening all, and we are on to part three of class struggles in France. And I'm going to do a very brief presentation, and then hopefully everyone will have their favourite quotes ready or something to discuss while we do that. See where it takes us. Everyone see that one?
Yep.
It's going to give me a full page thing.
It's slideshow you want to be.
There we go. Oh, and it's working and everything. Yeah, okay, so we're up to part three, but just quickly back over parts one and two. So we start with the fall of the July monarchy and the rise of the Republic. The bourgeois liberals and Republicans try to restrict change to sort of constitutional reshuffles, but the Paris workers, demand a republic and force the provisional government, including some socialists, to concede things like the right to work and the national workshops and the debates around that. The national workshops were there to placate the workers, and while the bourgeoisie mobilised against them, and this culminated in the June Days uprising, where the working class was brutally suppressed, making its first great independent political struggle, marking that, and its first great defeat. So once the workers are defeated, it's the bourgeois fractions that dominate. The Party of Order, monarchists, both Bourbon and Orleans, unite around property, while the petty bourgeois Democrats hope to extend the revolution and assumed they could manage the new universal suffrage, meaning male suffrage, but nevertheless. So Marx shows how in December 48 presidential elections crystallised these contradictions. The bourgeois candidate Cavaignac, the general who'd crushed the June workers, was rejected, while the peasant masses seeking debt relief and a paternal protector voted overwhelmingly for Louis Bonaparte, who was the famous Napoleon's nephew. And thus the presidency became a new centre of power, resting not on the assembly but on the peasantry, and setting up the tension between parliament and the executive that would dominate the next stage. So, as I said, I think we've just said that. So you have the bourgeois Republicans around the Party of the National, who are losing power, and the monarchist fractions unite as the Party of Order, and they're all held together by the fear of the working class. But the peasants were the mass base for the new president, for Louis Bonaparte, and they won these reforms in the French Revolution, but they were fragmented and spread across the country, so generally very conservative but very isolated. They were swayed by promises of debt relief and protection, the delivering of former national glory like the original Napoleon, and they, of course, the first experiment with universal suffrage ended up with monarchist in the presidency. The democratic petty bourgeoisie, they are represented by, we had a bit of an exchange on the thing about this, Ledru Rollin and the Montagne. So over and over again, in terms of rhetoric, Marx goes back to this, first time as tragedy, the second time as farce thing. So we have La Montagne, which was, the radical end of the French Revolution, the original French Revolution in 1789. And by the time we get to the 1848 revolutions, we got a pale shadow of it, who feared both the monarchy and the proletarian radicals. Then in June 1840, there was earlier in that year, Garibaldi in Italy staged an uprising in Rome and declared a republic, drove the Pope out and declared a republic, and Louis Napoleon sent French troops to restore the Pope. And so the petty bourgeois Democrats are outraged at this, the French Republic being used against another republic, and they rose in rebellion about that, and it wasn't properly passed by the Parliament, all that sort of thing, and but they were crushed. And so, without a sort of mass base in the working class, the petty bourgeoisie doesn't really have a lot of power. So the party of order comes to dominate the National Assembly. Bonaparte's building his personal power base amongst the peasants. The workers are defeated. The petty bourgeois are disoriented. And, there's an unstable balance between the National Assembly and the president. I wanted to sort of focus my comments on what I think is important about here, like staying close to the text, but talking about, okay, so what? So what for us now, So this is the first time, you see universal suffrage is conceded in 1848 as a democratic reform, and this creates a tension between the notion of political equality and social inequality. Now, the bourgeoisie has to manage this reform to prevent other classes who are the majority getting into power, right? Marx expected that workers would be able to use suffrage to assert independent class power, but the June 48 insurrection was crushed, and that sort of took them out of their political role. And with no independent workers' party, suffrage is left to other class forces, namely, as we said, the peasantry, who suddenly emerge as a political force. All these fragmented small-holding peasants suddenly had a vote and could, even though they weren't sort of organised as a class, just their sheer numbers mean they were able to elevate Louis Napoleon into the presidency. And so you had a plebiscitary peasantry outside parliamentary control now. So the bourgeois fractions have to try to find a way to manage this. Sometimes they use the parliament, sometimes they use the law and repression to contain democracy from below, and they have to, neutralise the potential of universal suffrage. And of course, Bonaparte's playing the game between the parliament and the popular vote. I mean, he can claim, as we would say now, a mandate. I have a mandate to rule. I got the majority of votes, and who are you guys? So he's got that. You can throw your weight around. You can try to throw your weight around, but I've got. So they moved the impeachment, and and then they ended up losing like 350 votes to 7 or something, because they decided then they would abstain from the vote. Just like a complete chaos. So the problem then is how do you neutralise democracy while preserving the form? And Bonapartism emerges as one solution to this contradiction. The mobilised peasant voters could build executive power, and that could be used to discipline all classes. There's always somebody sort of above the parliament who can, an above class society that can be used to control things. Be interesting to think about this. We talked last week. I'm going to mention it anyway, but yeah, so I'll come back to that. Bourgeoisie couldn't simply revoke suffrage without undermining its own legitimacy, and instead it sought to manage it through the various institutions, alliance and repression when necessary. Workers were excluded, the peasants were decisive, and the petty bourgeoisie was marginalised, which opens the path to a more direct, what we will see, direct, Bonapartist rule. Thinking about the implications of this for us, we all have a sense, I think, that, the whole bourgeois democracy thing's a bit of a sham, but it's interesting to see it emerging. And I'm certainly not pretending to be an expert in any of these really, but I can say something about the Australian one. And we did mention something about Chartism last week, and I'm sure you guys will have something to say about it, but just in sort of a couple of lines. So in France, we see suffrage and we end up with Bonapartism, with plebiscitary executive power. In Britain, suffrage is delayed a long time and dribbles out in various reform acts and is eventually co-opted. Be interesting to think about the role of the king and the crown there, which was played out quite differently. American comrades might be able to straighten me up on this one, but suffrage was extended early for white people and managed via the parties. With race and colonial expansion, it culminates in the Civil War as the great rupture. In Australia, Australian workers were pretty radical early on and got the vote early on too. But it came to it, and the unions were quite strong, there were mass unions in Australia in the 1870s. And this culminated in the Great Strikes in 1891. when shearers, miners, and wharfies all went on strike, and it was effectively in a colonial economy like Australia, that was the economy. It was like a general strike. It was put down by force, and that led to the formation of Labor parties in Australia and the election, very early election of Labor parties in the state of Queensland. It might have even been in the late. It only lasted for a few weeks, but it was one in the just before the turn of the century. A Labor Party ruled Queensland, the state of Queensland, for a short while. There are, of course, it's a white settler society, Australia, so there are racial exclusions. It's colonial capitalism, and eventually the unions are co-opted through the Labor Party. And there's some debate about the spelling. Historically, for reasons that are never entirely clear, Australian Labor Party's official title uses the American spelling of Labor. I'm not sure why, but it's Labor. It's not my, it's not my American grammar checker. That's how it was originally spelled. So they're taking some cue, I assume, from the US. So this sort of Bonapartism, where someone is able to sort of push themselves above the fray, as it were, above the strain, is a bourgeois response to democracy in the conditions of social inequality. The state rises above society and balanced classes while preserving property. It reveals also, as we said before, the immaturity of the proletarian movement at this point in its development. They lack the power to carry out a revolution, and of course it also shows the limits of that petty bourgeois leadership. So the first independent political struggle of the working class is what Marx says June was, 1848. And its first great defeat symbolises the failure of the left to realise the emancipatory potential of democracy. That's my introduction to get us started. So, Jeff, tell me why.
Sorry, Shane, I was just asking you a question. When you said the state rises above society, balancing the classes, I know that's an argument put forward in the 18th Brumaire. I didn't see it in this one. Have I missed something?
Yeah, no, I was just jumping ahead a bit, like, because we're coming on just as to how Bonapartism is sort of emerging. I mean, eventually, yeah, there's going to be a coup, right? Wiley?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Two things. First, this reading was very important for me because of a tendency in the States here, particularly on the left, to be dismissive of bourgeois democracy. As you said, a number of us tended to treat it as a sham. And I think that's something that's characteristic of sizable sections of the population. I think anybody looking at the statistics know that voting participation in the states is generally always quite low. About 59 to 60% of the voting eligible population tends to participate. So this is very important for me. I'm going to really give real close study to this question of universal suffrage, particularly in situations in France. The other thing that's important is that we tend to, in the States, to overlook is not giving enough attention to the fractional inter-class struggle within the ruling class in particular. For example, if you look at the history of the Civil War, one tends to look at the Republican Party, the formation of the Republican Party, sort of monolithically as homogeneous. It was far from that. Those various fractions played out during the period of Reconstruction in terms of a number of things. I'll just leave it at that. But the decisive I think in terms of politics in the United States was a denial of the vote, particularly to the freed slaves in the South, which led to the development of basically a one-party system in the South, and the generalization of Jim Crow into the level of national policy throughout the country. Finally, one of the things that is involved for me is to really try to understand the fissures and fractures that exist contemporaneously with the U.S., the party system in the U.S. Every election cycle, you get this, like with Obama, it was viewed as the utter demise of the Republican Party. If you read the press at that time, it was a question of how will the Republican Party ever come back to compete. With Trump, it's a similar kind of thing materialized in the bourgeois press in terms of the Democratic Party. So gaining a grasp of the fractions in terms of trying to locate these fissures that are developing within these parties is difficult, and something we have to pay attention to here in the States. Finally, again, in terms of this, historically, we've always had, at least since the Civil War, this binary two-party system, in the sense that there's obviously never developed a real labor party in this country, so that many of the working class had to fight for reforms primarily through the Democratic Party. But both of those parties have done everything within their power to prevent the emergence of any kind of viable third party movement. And where they have occurred, in terms of viable third party efforts, it seems to have been on the part of the ruling class. I think the last example I can think of was a movement by H. Ross Perot in the late 80s. But that's it. It's basically a point out. This has really been education for me in terms of those two concepts: fractionation in the parties and universal suffrage.
George?
Yes. I would like actually, to a certain degree, really express my reservation. That is, we shouldn't diminish the role of intra-class struggle, because Marx discusses that the whole revolution, the first revolution that occurred, was a reaction against the bourgeois monarchy, as he calls it, the political form of bourgeois monarchy, the June Revolution, the July monarchy, sorry, that was controlled and represented the class interests of the financial aristocracy. It was a specific, particular segment of the ruling class that controlled the state and imposed its own conditions of rule. Okay, so the revolution that overturned the July monarchy was the expression of the industrial bourgeoisie, which is again another segment that was remaining outside political power till that period. Okay, so it is actually an inside, if you like, inside the class between competing class interests. And actually, the reaction, if you like, against the political representation of the industrial bourgeoisie was the so-called Constituent Assembly. And we see, after the establishment of the Constituent Assembly and the preparation of a new constitution, that, as Marx says, a constitution always consolidates the new class relations. In other words, the ascendance of the industrial bourgeoisie in political power means that the growing class basis of the industrial bourgeoisie was getting stronger, and it could achieve this kind of overturning the established political regime and assume the responsibility to establish the new constitution. But still, that didn't eliminate the class and the attempt of the former political ruling class, that is that of the financial aristocracy, doing a kind of counter-revolution, if you like, and restoring its power back in the form of the Party of Order. Okay, so it's a quite complicated set of conflicts between various class sections and fractions that also mobilize and create coalitions with the subordinate classes, whether these are both the petty bourgeoisie, the peasants, and the proletariats,
Right.
playing the game, if you like, in order to achieve the actual conquest of political power. And I have a nice quote in this regard, and I will finish with that. A nice quote that says that we have a kind of transposition of class roles. He doesn't use this expression. I formulate it in this way. He says, in France, the petty bourgeoisie does what the industrial bourgeois would like to do. And the worker does what the task of the bourgeois to do is. In other words, rather than each class assuming the responsibility to put in power or in the public sphere the expression of its class interest, actually plays the role of a kind of surrogate, a surrogate class force for another class. Okay, so this is interesting because it touches also on the question of political illusions through which various class movements mobilize themselves in believing that they will achieve their goals that correspond to their class interests, but actually these aims do not correspond to their own class interests. So that's why I use this expression, transposition of class roles. The quote is from page 111 from the Penguin edition.
Oh. Liz.
I haven't read the part 3. I'm trying to catch up, so I'm just going back to the former article, Marx's article, where he speaks about the nameless realm of the Republic. The bourgeois Republicans of the National did not represent any large faction of their class resting on economic foundations, and that when the Constitution is attempted to be used for this new class, this sort of progressive class, the bourgeois rather than the monarchists. When it fails because of the monarchists and the more conservative bourgeoisie aligning themselves with Orleanists and the legitimists, that it's not falling back into nothing, it's falling back to the prior power of the monarchy. So Marx says, he talks about the two so he talks about the Republican form of bourgeois rule, but it's only a form because its content is quite different. Thus, we find royalists in the beginning believing in an immediate restoration, later preserving the Republican form with foaming rage and deadly invective against it on their lips, and finally confessing that they can endure each other. These are the two factions of the of the monarchists. They can endure each other only in the Republic. So it's this great irony that their strength and their interests are strengthened by hosting their interests within the Republic created by the bourgeoisie, because we're falling back now, because progress has been curtailed by the reaction, the counter-revolution. So we find these, they can only endure each other only in the Republic, and postponing the restoration indefinitely. Why do they postpone the restoration? Because the enjoyment of united rule itself strengthened each of the two factions and made each of them still more unable and unwilling to subordinate itself to the other, that is, to restore the monarchy, because they backed two different horses in terms of one type of dynastic rule and the other. So they were unable to restore a king because each would have negated the other, because they backed different horses, different kings, different, this is a real Hegelian. I mean, you can see all the Hegelian constructs in dialectically sort of opposites coming together for a third thing, the identity of a concept and its material reality being a contradiction, and having to sort of go further to elucidate out what falls outside of what that concept is for each party. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that, I don't know if that's very clear, but and then to go again to sort of refine by reasserting interests, what the constitution or the executive should look like.
Yeah, it's interesting how the contingencies are all played out, and how it makes strange bedfellows, as they say. Jeff?
Yeah, the nature of there's two things which come up. One I'll leave later, but one I'll leave later refers to what George was talking about the rule of finance, because that becomes only clear, I think, very clear on pages 58 to 59 of the shared document, when he talks about comparing French capitalism with Britain. And I think I'd like to leave that up for the moment. The thing that really strikes me is the strength of the document, and of the whole document comes out on page 50. And that's Marx's grasp, I'm not so keen on Hegel as a lot of people here. I used to be very keen on Hegel in the Middle Ages when I was young, but not so much now. But what Marx did have a grasp of was power, and the decisiveness of power. He knows that there are a lot of factions in flux, and he also notes who has the power and is able to act decisively wins. The bourgeois Republicans, as he calls them, the mountain, are not able to act decisively. They're bounced around between order and the more radical forces. But it becomes clear on page 50 when the the Republicans generally try to condemn Bonaparte for restoring the Pope in Rome. They point out that the Constitution forbids this. It rather reminds me of the way the Democrats are acting in America now. This is not constitutional. How dare you do it? You mustn't be allowed to do it. And on page 50, Marx puts the point as clearly as Trump would have put it, I'm afraid, if I can find it. He says in the last paragraph of page 50, to be sure, the Constitution forbade any attack on the liberty of foreign peoples. But what the French army attacked in Rome was, according to the ministry, not liberty, but the despotism of anarchy. It's rather like Trump talking about what's free speech and what isn't, etc. Had the mountains still not comprehended, all experience in the Constituent Assembly notwithstanding, that the interpretation of a constitution did not belong to those who had made it, but but only to those who had accepted it, that its wording must be construed in its viable meaning, and that the bourgeois meaning was the only viable meaning. The constitutional niceties are neither here nor there. It's who has power. We're seeing that in America at the moment when Trump is riding roughshod over long-established separations and balances of power. Roosevelt did the same actually in the 1930s from the left, but it's met similar outrage from the established people. The fact is that constitutional niceties don't mean anything when it's power. You can interpret a constitution how you will. This reminded me when Shane was talking about universal suffrage in America. He saw the Civil War as a rupture. It wasn't a rupture, it was an interruption, because Black people would suddenly receive a vote for a few years and had it taken off them. The US Constitution tried to establish the vote for Black people and enshrine it in law. But how that was interpreted in practice depended on who controlled the Constitution, who wrote it. And the Supreme Court wrote that, of course, we're all equal under the Constitution, but nevertheless, we are different, and these differences must be compiled in Brown v. Education, in the Brown ruling, I think, of 1896. It's and Black people were thereby, the exclusion of the Black people from the vote was made real. And if they ever tried to exercise their power, then violence was used against them of the most extreme kind, because it's not constitutional niceties which count, but who has power, which is why women didn't get the vote in America until 1920, and Black people didn't really get the vote in the South until the 1970s, 60s, 70s. So it's the same here. It's a question of power. And what you're seeing throughout this is whoever acts decisively wins. If you don't act decisively, you get bounced around. I think Lenin learned that lesson in 1917. But it's something that really comes across as the strength of Marx in understanding the flux and outcome of the revolution.
Marilyn.
Hi. Yes, just very briefly, I thank you, Elizabeth, and also for the first introduction that went over part 2, because I didn't get that one read very well. And so I appreciate the catch up. But I did read this, and I thought it was wonderful. First, because of the details it goes into that George was talking about in terms of the contradictions among the various bourgeois factions. But the other thing I loved was that it talked about the socialists too. I'm still just doing things on my iPhone, and I've got to find a way to be able to quote you things I like. But where there's one paragraph where he goes, well, this was this for socialists, and socialism was this for somebody else, and socialism was that for somebody else. And all of that says to me, I'm here not to understand Marx in the abstract, although of course that's necessary in order to apply it in the concrete. But for me, this part 3, if I could just break it down into like a chart or a guide, it seems to me that this is what's necessary for those of us. I'm sure this is true in every country. Ours, we are just so clearly, and I see this a little bit in what I hear about France and England, that we are so clearly approaching a time where these things are manifesting themselves in the pre-revolutionary activity in the United States. And it's just a guide almost to, here's what you have to look for and here's what you have to analyze. And I kept thinking about Marx sitting in this library, and I'm like, oh, how did he know all this stuff? But I just really appreciate, number one, this part, and number 2, the insights that I gained from you guys talking about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mal. I do think we sort of downplay a bit. I mean, there's this famous, I was thinking during the week, is that famous thing about Lenin saying Marxism has three component parts, French socialism, British political economy, and German philosophy. I think that really downplays Marx's activist side. He's organising the International, he's helping, write the People's Paper of the Chartist movement. He's got his hands in all of that. And it's true, of course, he did spend time in the British Library, of course, but I always think that gets brought up because that's academics who write it and that's what they do. So they can immediately identify with being in the British Library, and all these social movements and revolutionary movements don't mean much to them. So they see Marx through that lens, whereas in fact he was, heavily involved in all these movements as well. We should add Chartism or, as the fourth element or something, political organizer. George.
Okay. First of all, I think that Elizabeth's remark about the Hegelian form is very incisive, because actually what we have is that the opposition between the two forms, the bourgeois monarchy and the bourgeois republic, led to the third political form, which is the constituted republic, says Marx. Okay. And not only that, there is a new contradiction within the constitutional republic that has incorporated the classes through the franchise, through the granting of the franchise, that whereas initially the political logic was that Bonaparte, holding the president's chair, would be a neutral man, a kind of arbitrator, if you like, between the two clashing bourgeois or two clashing sections of the ruling class, ended up being a center of power himself. So he started coming into opposition to the majority held by royalists in the assembly. And that created a new kind of crisis. But I would like to make another point now that concerns the untrustworthy coalition between the petty bourgeoisie and the socialist elements, let's say, of the proletariat. Now, the Montaigne, as the representatives of the democratic petty bourgeoisie, aim at a parliamentary insurrection. This is the idea of the impeachment that you also discussed in the interview. Expecting to break the power of the bourgeoisie without unleashing the proletariat. That means using it in a support role without the danger of mobilizing the proletariat in its own. So in other words, the petty bourgeoisie itself tried to exploit the power, the street power, if you like, or mobilization power that the proletariat held for its own benefit. And now I go into the point. Nevertheless, they lost the impeachment vote, and we had a kind of repressive reaction on the part of the regime. So I want to stress a little bit what took place. The rejection of impeachment consolidated the parliamentary despotism. So we have political nuances here that we shouldn't disregard. It's one thing to have parliamentary despotism. One other thing is to have parliamentary egalitarian operation of the parliament and recognition of the existence of the different political parties participating in it and representing the various social and class interests of the society. So we have parliamentary despotism of the majority, which proceeded to enact repressive measures of parliament against the parliamentary opposition. It decreed new standing orders, abolishing freedom of the rostrum, and empowered the chairman of the National Assembly, I quote, to punish representatives who violated these standing orders with censorship, fines, confiscation of salaries, temporary expulsion, or prison. In other words, conditions that have nothing to do with the proper operation of a parliament. Such like repressive measures are very common also in many authoritarian parliamentary republics all over the world, in Asia, Latin America, and lately in some European countries, and possibly in the United States also, because we hear a lot of punitive measures that have to be introduced in the houses for a kind of recalcitrant or defiant representatives. So the description by Marx of the repressive measures taken by the parliamentary despotism is a situation that we find it very commonly also in contemporary political frameworks. Now, the democratic petty bourgeoisie lost its parliamentary power and its armed power also. They demobilized the mobile guard that represented, let's say, the armed power controlled by the petty bourgeoisie. The royalist majority, representing the bourgeois republic, launched a full-scale repressive attack by enacting also a new press law, a new law of association, a new law on the state of siege. In other words, they could proclaim a state or extend a state of siege at any time. States of siege, we know, it is an emergency situation. That is dictatorship. So they could decree a dictatorship at any time, abolishing the parliament. They drove out political refugees, and here I want to mention an interesting anecdote. Driving out political refugees. Now, they expelled Engels, who was at the time in Paris, and proceeded on foot to exit France, walking through the countryside on foot, meeting with hundreds of peasants that gave him much empirical material so as to make a detailed study of the peasantry as a class, because he has written whole essays later on, Engels, on analyzing the peasantry, which we will be discussing in the 18th primaire. Now, the repressive measures of regime also arrested newspaper editors and intellectuals, imposed military despotism in the 5 surrounding departments, activated the ubiquitous courts, which were crowded with their own loyal judges, purged again an army of civil servants, says Marx. And I quote, "These were the inevitable, the constantly recurring commonplaces of the victorious forces of reaction." So we are talking about a reactionary regime. Mention, says Marx, because this time they were directed not only against Paris, but also against the departments, which were the stronghold of petty bourgeois and proletarian strata. That's my interpolation. Not only against the proletariat, but above all against the middle classes. So we have a ruling class that, in a sense, generalized repression against every kind of class standing in opposition to itself. And I conclude with the following. The pro-monarchical majority prorogated the parliament, says Marx, for 3 months and so on. That's from page 114, leaving a commission of devout royalists to serve as guardians of the republic. And I quote Marx now. The irony was more profound than they suspected. Condemned by history to help in the overthrow of the monarchy they loved, they were destined by history to conserve the republic which they hated. Now, my interpretation. Both expressions highlight the Marxian and Hegelian theme that the role played by social actors in history, whether they are political representatives or class factions or sects and fractions, is not a realization of their intended political will. It's not an expression of voluntarism. It is an expression of voluntarism, but this is not the essence, but the outcome of large historical forces taking place behind their backs that negate the intentions or even boomeranging against the intended political ends producing unintended consequences in the short or long-term historical social process. And I just want to raise a question in my conclusion. Surely, the intentions of the socialist revolutions in Russia was not to build a socialist regime that would collapse after 70 years. Obviously, they didn't have the intention of, by building a socialist society, that should somehow end pretty soon. Okay. Obviously, they didn't know that it would collapse. But had they learned the lessons derived from the revolutionary defeats of the 1848? For example, of having a European socialist geopolitical ecosystem supportive of this singular revolution in one country. Because we see that one condition for having a successful socialist revolution, says Marx, we saw that in the previous part, means that you have European revolutions in many countries that can create a supporting network for the revolution, for the proletarian revolution in France, both in terms of trade, social division of labor, and so on and so on, and in terms of support of the ideas of a socialist society. Okay, I stop here.
Thanks, George. Liz again.
Just sort of go back to Jeff's point, that this progress, when it happens, and all the wrong turns different groups take. For example, I can't find where it is, but at one point, I think it's the bourgeois Republicans, more on the left, allow judges to be put into office. They do other things like they allow for more symbolic things. They allow for the two assassins of the army who killed the June insurgents to be killed rather than forgiven. I think we have to remember that we can't use power. Whoever has power is the one that does. It's more that progress tries to change, to create a constitution and then sanction a new set of social relations around it. By putting in judges, you're just bolstering the old power. Marx is sort of talking about, so this constitution, on the contrary, did not sanction any social revolution. It sanctioned the momentary victory of the old society over the revolution, because of the parties invested in it. It's talking, Marx always, I think, talks about, there were already people who had power. People are trying to wrest that power away, but they keep making these mistakes by using the judiciary and various taxes. Like, instead of doing progressive tax, they choose not to do progressive tax. Instead of supporting the Italian Garibaldi against the Pope, they choose to support the Pope because they're too invested. The bourgeois Republicans are invested in property. So this he calls it idealistic humbug. Fraternity and liberty becomes idealistic humbug when the actual chips are down, and it's how do you tax people? What does your judiciary look like? How does it carry out? In the case where the two men were condemned for avenging the murders of the insurgents. These are all going back to the former power structures. It's like without, I think Marx is sort of trying to say, breaking through the materialist basis of the old forms of power has to implant. He's implying that the seeds are there, but you have to implant new bearers, and that hasn't been able to be done because of the alliances that were made. It's very sort of short-term survival in this article.
Bill?
Yeah, I was struck by the idea that everything that is against the establishment is in a sense socialism, even when it's not socialism, and that so swiftly had the March of Revolution ripened conditions that the Friends of Reform conditions that the Friends of Reforms of all shades, the most moderate claims of the middle classes, were compelled to group themselves around the banner of the most extreme party of revolution, around the red flag. And I think it's kind of difficult to, I mean, it's been so long since there's been a revolution. It's almost difficult to imagine that this could happen. But I think this is the definition really of a revolutionary situation, is when the revolutionary party has to lead the nation. The nation has no options, no way forward. And the only way forward is to follow the most revolutionary party, and all of the factions of the oppressed fractions of the different classes therefore follow the revolutionary party. And there's a famous point where he talks about the permanence of the revolution. So he says, well, this socialism is the declaration of the permanence of the revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat, as a necessary transit point to the abolition of class distinctions generally, to the abolitions of the relations of production on which they rest, to the abolition of all the social relations which correspond to these relations of production, to the revolutionizing of all the ideas that rest from these social relations. So that's kind of very obviously potent phrase, but that was the inspiration really for Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution. Well, not just Trotsky's theory. In fact, most of the socialists of the Second International who are on the left wing had some kind of version of the theory of permanent revolution. But the idea was that you couldn't solve the normal problems of society through any other means than socialism. And so the way of achieving democracy was through socialism. Now, that's difficult to believe nowadays, but when you look at countries like, well, say in the UK, I would say, or although there's some discontent and grumbling, there's still no kind of action in the UK. But I teach students from Bangladesh and Nepal, and this is very kind of relevant, this description of society, because there you do have really a suppression of democratic rights, and you have this whole interweaving, intertangling of religious oppression, class oppression, the oppression of everyone outside of the ruling oligarchy, and you have big mass movements fighting for democracy, and there's been uprisings and general strikes and all kinds of kind of semi-insurrectionary activity in the last couple of years. And I talk to my students about it who are from Nepal. I mean, obviously they're middle class, they're in Britain studying, but they absolutely support the movement of the people, if you will, against the oligarchy. And you could see how, and you ask yourself, well, how could that win? How could they win? How could they emancipate society? You'd have to have the working class again. I mean, this hasn't happened yet, obviously, but the working class would have to lead the whole of the nation against the oligarchy. So that's the idea of permanent revolution. That's kind of very potent. I agree with Marilyn. This is very powerful writing, I think, from Marx, and it expresses that idea. Now, how do you relate that to the everyday life of Britain or America today? It's not that straightforward, is it? Because it does seem very far away. Certainly it does for me. But you know, the thing is that you do see that there's, I think again, he says it, the work of a month, you know, the work of years happens in a week, doesn't it? He says that elsewhere in this paragraph, little pamphlet, and you could see how you do unfortunately have periods of almost no social turmoil whatsoever, and that's been the case for the last 20 or 30 years, and you do imagine, is that going to last forever? And you have to say no, it won't, based on historical experience. What exactly happens, I don't know, but I think that's why this is kind of very vivid, this section and this analysis, and Marx kind of does relate that kind of those deep class movements to the idea of the emancipation of society, freedom, what that means, very, very well. And I think that's why it's so powerful.
Yeah, I think it's important about the differences, isn't it? I mean, one I mentioned before was these people are all members of the class. The people in the parliament are members of the class, whereas now they're professional representatives and their direct connections to the class are different. And I mean, what's a bit unusual about Trump is that he's had, what's his name? Elon Musk involved in the administration, because usually the capitalists don't dirty their hands with that stuff these days. And the other one I thought, as I was actually reading the thing too, was like talking about the peasants, is that expression of them being a sack of potatoes, but they're they're fragmented. He means, right? It's like they've got a collective sense, and then they're all bunched together like a sack of potatoes, but they don't really have any common way of expressing that. So it's fragmented, and that sort of made me. And he's thinking of individual plots of land too, but I do think that's a bit like the working class now, isn't it? They're fragmented into different groups and interests and how they see themselves, and so it's not the same. There's not a strong collective sense. Jeff.
John and Cynthia, who haven't spoken, want to go first? I don't mind, as long as I'm not forgotten.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No worries, John.
Yeah. I mean, reading this, I think trying to compare it to today and whatever, we're not in a revolutionary situation, of course. But I mean, what strikes me about this is the role of the petty bourgeoisie. And Marx, I think, didn't really see. I mean, what Marx showed was that capitalism would tend to destroy the petty bourgeoisie. What he didn't seem to notice, and why would he? Because there wasn't any evidence for it at the time, was that as the petty bourgeoisie was being destroyed as a class, it was also being recreated. So we've got then the influence of the petty bourgeoisie. Now, what we're seeing in Britain, America, numbers of other countries as well, it is the power of the petty bourgeoisie in terms of numbers and its effect on parties of the right. So, I mean, for example, in Britain, where I think we can see a very, very classic thing, where we have, I mean, what is now a disintegrating Conservative Party we have. But before that, we had a Conservative Party that was, it was actually quite unusual. This was pointed out to me some years ago in terms of Europe, in that in most European countries, there is a party of big business and a mass party of the right, and they're not the same. And the mass party of the right basically is the party of the petty bourgeoisie, but all they could do was support the bourgeoisie and the interests of the bourgeoisie. The thing about the petty bourgeoisie is that by its nature, it can't become a ruling class. Because what happens if you're a successful petty bourgeois? You become a bourgeois. And the interests of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie are not necessarily the same, not in all cases, certainly. I mean, for example, take the issue of Britain's membership of the EU. where you had this was, I mean, Britain joined the common market as it then was, under pressure from British capitalism, from the British bourgeoisie, because they wanted access to the European markets. Now, this developed. But the thing is, there's no such thing as a free lunch. To be able to have access to the European markets, then there have to be certain sort of regulations, like, for example, the quality of the products that you're selling and so forth have to be commensurable and so forth. This all costs money, but for the bourgeoisie, the amount that they pay to the EU is more than offset by their increased profits, because that's their increased profits from increased exports. Whereas the petty bourgeoisie, by and large, don't export. They're basically selling to their neighbours, to the people in this country, and therefore, when it came to should Britain be in the European Union, the petty bourgeoisie voted en masse for leaving, which meant that before that they also voted en masse within the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party had become democratized and given. I'm back when I was a lad. The MPs didn't even have a vote to who would be leader of the Conservative Party, but that it was the great and the good who decided these things behind closed doors and so forth. Which is how Britain ended up with Alec Douglas-Home as Prime Minister. And such was the reaction that things have gone so that now rank and file members of the Conservative Party have a vote on who will be leader. But there are more of them than there are of the bourgeois. So we had, when Boris Johnson was finally kicked out, we actually had a runoff between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And it's very clear to anybody, you don't have to be a major Marxist theorist to see that Liz Truss was the candidate of the petty bourgeoisie and Rishi Sunak was the one that big business wanted. And because of the Conservative Party had given its members a vote, the petty bourgeoisie won, and we got Liz Truss as Prime Minister. So those are the two extremes. Alec Douglas-Home, if the great and the good within the Conservative Party are the ones who are making the decision, and Liz Truss if it's the rank and file membership. But then, of course, such a disaster. Rishi Sunak came in as a sensible man, except that he turned out to be a complete disaster as well, even from the point of view of the Conservatives. So, but what we've got, I mean, in the United States, I mean, the political institutions work differently and so on and so forth. But effectively, who got Trump as candidate of the Republican Party? It was the American petty bourgeoisie. I disagree with Shane Singer. Was it Shane? I've forgotten who said it now. About the American working class being fragmented. I mean, it's not a fragmented working class. It's a fragmented petty bourgeoisie in America. Look at the geography of votes. It's the place that votes for the right-wing Republicans is the bit in the middle. It's not the industrialized bits down the sides, or the people. Jane Leeves on British television did actually comment about the when George Bush Jr. Got elected, about the people on the coast. She said they get out more. They voted Democrat. So we've got the fact is that the way capitalism developed is, I mean, Marx is right about his basic analysis, but it's worked out slightly more different in that the power within the numerical power within the Conservative Party, well, not just the numerical power, which is we could see with the French elections of of 1848 presidential elections, the numerical power of the petty bourgeoisie was there then, but the numerical power within the party, once they democratized, and this is seen. So we're seeing that we've then got the political power for the bourgeoisie is the candidate of the petty bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie, as perhaps we'll see with the 18th Brumaire, the bourgeoisie will adapt to it because this is a government running the capitalist system, and they want the capitalist system to run smoothly, and they'll work around all these things and all these obstructions. They have ways of doing this, and they have influence. And once people are up there in the thing, I mean, even when it isn't a billionaire like Trump, they use political connections and personal connections and things like that to manipulate them. But we're actually seeing in the present phase of capitalism, the petty bourgeoisie, who collectively, via their numerical influence within the parties of the right, have power but no responsibility, and we're getting a whole set of leaders of the right who reflect that. And I think perhaps that's worthwhile keeping in mind as something that's connected to what Marx is writing here, but is actually slightly, in some ways, more different. Should Trump be compared to Louis Bonaparte rather than Hitler or Mussolini? I don't know. I think that's something we need to think about.
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? How do you map? You can see the parallels, but how much you want to map, how strictly you want to draw the lines. I mean, I'd take your point about fragmented. I have to think about that a bit more. But the other thing is, I think of what do you call? I mean, no, we don't technically own the houses; the banks do, but people have a conception of themselves as owning their house. Which is the equivalent of owning a business, isn't it? In a petty bourgeois sense, you've got an investment in property that your average worker wouldn't have had in Paris in 1848, and nor would have expected to. But so, just in terms of drawing those parallels, it's a bit tricky, isn't it? Cynthia, and then Jeff.
Okay. Very interesting. Great reading, relevant for today, as we've all shown. Really appreciate the comments that are being made and the thoughts. What I'm reflecting on as I'm listening is one, that I think we would agree that the stage that we're at is the stage of the bourgeois revolution, and that all the discussion that we're having about rallying around the red flag, and that social motion, in effect, was what made possible the consolidation of the bourgeois revolution. If I understand correctly, that's what we've been reading and that's what we've been talking about. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And it relates, in my opinion, to what has not come up, is this question that, or the observation that Marx makes, that, in the social relations of capital, even the bourgeois must carry out their role as intended by capital, just like the proletariat must work in order to live. The capitalist must use his resources to augment the production of commodities. And so that there are roles that capitalism demands. And as we well know from what we've been discussing in relationship to France, the role of the peasantry and the role of the agricultural production is a significant part of the social development. So the reason I'm saying that is just that I think we've been discussing, and it's essential to do it because that's what this is about, but to keep in mind that underlying were the activities that people had to engage in order to survive on a daily basis. That is the real life. And that, I mean, what's striking by reading this is that the political expressions of that are inadequate, and as we note, a lot is that they don't necessarily reflect the real interest of the people, like the peasantry voting in such a way that in the end they voted against the salt tax and then it was imposed, and many examples like that, right? So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to get, and what I get a picture of is this assertion of and the reality of the development of capitalism going on, and that in the end, that creates the conditions then for this bourgeois revolution and the dominance of the bourgeois political power. And then, to me, that relates to something that we haven't talked about, is the difference between the political activity, which is prominent here and is absolutely essential in any revolutionary process, and the state. And so I conclude or surmise or that the resolution of this stage of the revolutionary process is in reality consolidating the state that will continue as various political vicissitudes develop over time, and that is, to me, extremely relevant in terms of looking at what's happening in the U.S., because here we are witnessing political turmoil of the most, extreme that we've seen in a long time, and underlying it is, no doubt, a real revolutionary push in the objective situations, in the economic situation, but what's not adequately addressed, in my opinion, is the role of the state in its separateness from the political. And if I'm wrong, please speak to it and correct me. But that's what's on my mind. Thank you.
Jeff, and then George.
Yeah, Shane, I can't get this hands work. Can you recognize me at a point?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff.
Is it me now?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Cynthia. Understanding the state is crucial, and I think that will start coming out, I hope, in future classes. But there are other understandings. I've talked about the strength of Marx in looking at power, but I think there are great weaknesses in Marx in looking at class. And this comes out very clearly in the end of page 58 to the beginning of page 59, where he compares France and French capitalism with English capitalism. The difficulty is that Marx is the good thing is that Marx is trying to stand back from the flux of political struggles and show these struggles in the context of the development of capitalism. Now, as he's not yet started developing an understanding of class, which he hopefully, which I think he's starting to do in Capital. And therefore what we're getting is a sociological problem, a sociological reductionism. He talks about bourgeois classes on page 50, and it says that the bourgeois classes, the legitimists and the Orleanists in alliance with legitimacy and awareness, nowhere near that. But he flits around in many ways talking about the bourgeois class. But I think what makes it clear is this crucial passage on page 58. In England, he says, and the largest French manufacturers, the largest of the French manufacturers are petty bourgeois compared with their English rivals. He says in England, there we find class struggles much more developed. The English bourgeoisie are in the lead. Cobden, Bright, these people are in the lead in the democratic struggles of 1848. Whereas in France, the manufacturers are too weak to do anything. And I think that's also part of the cause that the working class doesn't actually play much of a part in this revolution. Their part is one of being hammered in the June days, where they are massacred without any further reaction. Now, Marx is trying to say that is looking at classes without relating them to capitalist production. And that leads to sociology, a sociological reductionism, which is weak. But in this page 58 to 59, he is comparing them. If I can find the passage. He says that in England, industry predominates. In France, agriculture. In England, industry requires free trade. In France, protective tariffs, national monopoly, alongside the other monopolies. French industry does not dominate French production. The French industrialists, therefore, do not dominate the French bourgeoisie. And that's the same with others. It comes to a false ending in this thing. He thinks the revolution is on the cards. In England, the revolution is about to occur. And in France, the working class are finally about to establish the class dictatorship. Marx does tend to get overexcited about these things. In the stock exchange crisis of 1857, Marx and Engels were rushing around clutching themselves that the revolution was about to happen, that capitalism was about to fall about their ears, which it didn't. And to me, if you look at something Marx was unable to look at, which is what happened after 1850, Napoleon III didn't represent the peasantry. Napoleon III used the state in order to increase French manufacturing. In the 20 years between Marx writing this and the Paris Commune, French capitalism really developed, especially French banking and French industry. And it did it because Napoleon was able to ally with England through the treaty between Chevalier and Cobden in 1860. He opened French trade to English trade and thereby boosted them both. French capitalism was able to dominate. Marx's sociological analysis is not able to show that. He's able just to see the working class is about to have a revolution. But if you look at England in 1848, what you see is an absence of revolution. In the whole of Europe, revolution is exploding. Democratic revolutions on the whole, with a social element in the Rhineland and in France. But nevertheless, in England, you would expect the proletariat to be confronting the bourgeoisie. Marx says in this, interestingly, he doesn't follow it up, he says that this happens in Lyon, in France, where the working class and the bourgeoisie are confronting one another. From what I can gather, the revolution takes a much more radical turn there. But in England, it's going nowhere. There's been tremendous agitation and class struggle in the 1830s and 40s. And Chartism arose on the back of that class struggle, on the back of a large number of strike movements in the early 1830s, including a failed attempt at a general strike. But Chartism was much more past its active phase by the time that the French Revolution takes place. There is an attempt to mobilise a third charter in 1848. The first two had failed in armed insurrection and in big strikes. But in 1848, the charters organised a mass demo, a monster demo, and the British rulers were terrified. They saw Paris being repeated on the streets of London. They brought artillery to Kennington Common. They mobilised the army, ready to destroy it. And all that happened was that people marched and then walked home again. And it was the end of Chartism. Chartism, far from leading to revolution, collapsed. The trade union movement, which had been so militant in the 1830s and 40s, became much more moderate, much more collaborationist with the employers, not for the next year or two, but for the next 40 years. Right up until the end of the 1880s, British trade unionism was collaborationist with the employers. And so far from being the revolution is coming, what you had in England was a major burst of capitalist expansion helping France. And the dynamics of capital production came along. Now, when Marx writes Capital, I think he's trying to reshape or sharpen the meaning of class. Instead of talking about the bourgeoisie as the ruling class, as a legitimacy or leanness, and talking about bourgeoisie here and there, but in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie is a capitalist class, the owners of the means of production, the proletariat of those who are employed by the capitalist class. But the same sharpness is tarnished here. So I think that if you look at it and stand back from historically, you can see where Marx is driving at. You can see why Marx thinks the working class has failed in France in 1848, but I think he's not gone far enough yet.
Well, in that sense, they failed in England too, right? But in terms of, there wasn't a socialist revolution in England either. It just sort of played out differently. George?
I would like to let Greg speak first, and then I can talk.
Okay,
Because
Greg?
Greg has spoken.
Yeah, sorry. The bit that I thought was really got me in the text was the sections on the peasantry, and if they were 2/3 of the population, what percentage of the population were actually proletariat? Sorry, I got these headphones in. I'm gonna have to take them out. So, yeah, anyways, I've marked a lot of that. Some of it I didn't quite get when he was talking about the price of land, when the land had been ceded to the peasants after the revolution, and then some pages later, I think I understand it when he starts talking about the taxes that are placed upon the peasantry, and so I imagine that that's the cost of the upkeep of the land, but I'm not convinced that the revolutions are the locomotives of history, and that the peasants are ready to sort of storm the Bastille again. The gradual revolutionizing of the peasants is manifested by many symptoms. Already revealed itself in the elections of the Legislative Assembly. The revolutionizing of the most stationary class is most clearly evident since the reintroduction of the wine tax. Yeah, I just want to know how revolutionary they were. And I think what you said, Shane, about the similarity perhaps between the peasantry and workers today in not seeing themselves as a class is perhaps true.
Thanks, Craig. George?
Okay. First of all, a clarification. The judges were appointed by the monarchical royalists during 1830s and afterward. But Bonaparte, when he was elected through getting so much support, he gave them life tenure. So he, in a sense, made them, support the regime and the judicial policies that the regime wanted to promote, basically to exercise repression and imprison people, and revolution is a big like that. Now, a second point in regard to a remark made by Say, monarchy, says Marx, covered the rule of the big bourgeoisie, in other words, the financial aristocracy, and I quote, by ideologically disinterested men, that is, persons who were not directly expressive of its interests, of the interests of the financial aristocracy. But the bourgeois republic, he says, in a cynical fashion, appointed the bourgeois proper names of the dominant class interests. For example, Fuld, who was the major representative of the big finance capital, was given the Ministry of the Bourse. So, does the appointment, that's my question concerning the contemporary situation. So, does the appointment of billionaires in cabinet positions tell something to the working class and to the other subordinate classes about which class interests are being served? Or is it a cause of celebration that they have finally achieved a vicarious grip on power for their own interests? Okay, because we have been discussing the issue of class consciousness. You have, in the United States, you have directly billionaire capitalists appointed to cabinet ministries or states. Okay. So we have explicit serving of big capital interests. Does that ring a bell, let's say, to the working class? Or it is fine? Okay. Certainly it rings a bell to the petty bourgeoisie, because the billionaires are the idealized figures of the American dream for the petty bourgeois entrepreneurs. So there is no kind of class of interest here, ideologically speaking. But let me make my main point. Marx, again, in this third section, discusses and analyzes the centrality of the public debt concerning the whole mobilization and conflicts, class conflicts created around its control. Okay. Now, Bonaparte, we are in the middle of 1849, has already started a campaign against the Party of Order that holds the majority in the National Assembly. In other words, he does not want to play the role of the neutral man that supposedly they have given him in order to ensure a kind of balance and equilibrium between the two classes of power. Okay. Now, Marx is discussing two strategies that the French state, controlled by the financial aristocracy, could have taken in order to address the problem of the public debt that really creates crisis situations and enrages the people. So I'm reading now. How does public property come to fall into the hands of high finance? This is from page 110. Due to the growing indebtedness of the state, And what causes the indebtedness of the state? The constant excess of its expenditure compared with its revenue, a disproportion which is both the cause and the effect of the system of state law. And he proceeds. The first strategy. One way for the state to free itself from this indebtedness would be to curb its expenditure. That is, simplify and reduce the size of the government organism. In other words, he is presenting the essential elements of a neoliberal policy. Okay. First, reduce the size of the government organism, govern as little as possible, no intervention in the self-regulation of the market economy, another major thesis of neoliberalism, employ as small a personnel as possible, and have as few dealings with bourgeois society as possible. And he continues. This course was impossible for the party of order, where means of repression, that's why I mentioned that huge array of repressive measures taken against the rest of the subordinate classes, including the petty bourgeoisie, whose means of repression, official interference in the name of the state, and omnipresence through the organs of state were bound to increase the more the rule of its class and its conditions of life were threatened from an increasing number of quarters. The gendarmerie, which is the military, let's say, or the National Guard, cannot be reduced in size while attacks on persons and property increase. In other words, it couldn't follow a neoliberal policy of shrinking the state, the bureaucracy, the civil service, the military forces, because it had need of means of repression and to continue on repressing possible revolts and the disconnected class strata in the society. So,
George, could I ask a question?
Yes.
You were quoting there just now. Was that from class struggles in France? Your quotation.
Yes, page 110, 110. And he goes to the second strategy.
Sorry,
Alternatively,
George is quoting from the Penguin edition, I think, aren't you?
yes, from the Penguin New Left Review edition.
Yeah, which is not the one that
We're all
some of us
using.
are working from.
Okay. But it is in the third essay, the third section. So the second strategy. Alternatively, the state would have to try to avoid debt and produce an immediate but temporary balance in the budget by placing extraordinary taxes on the soldiers of the richest classes. They had to tax the bourgeoisie or the upper bourgeoisie and the landed ownership and so on. But was the party of order to sacrifice its own wealth? These were the controllers of the national wealth on the altar of the fatherland. In order to withdraw the national wealth from exploitation by the birds? Question mark. Pas si bête. It's not so stupid, says that's the interpretation of the French. So we see that they were in an impasse. On the one hand, they had to increase the expenditures of the state. They couldn't minimize, they couldn't shrink the state in order to address and implement repressive measures to suppress the mobilizations of the people. And on the other hand, they had to tax the richer classes, but they couldn't do that because they belonged to that class and they had control of the birds, and so they couldn't self-tax themselves. Okay, so they were in impasse, and they will be facing this kind of crisis concerning the impact of an increasing public debt over the society and, of course, the distribution. And that's why they introduced the so-called taxes on the peasants. And this way, Bonaparte himself violated the promise to the peasants that he wouldn't tax them. Okay, so there was another. This is a good example of the general argument of Marx, that what political representatives of various class functions or even classes as a whole intend to do and implement and apply in the sphere of politics goes against deeper underlying processes, social and economic, if you like, processes that distort or create boomerang into their intentions of promoting one or another policy. And I think this is important to understand because it's a contribution to theoretical analysis on the part of Marx. Okay.
Thanks, George. John?
Shane?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Again,
Wally.
I can't operate this
That's
hand,
right.
so
Sorry, Wally. I just forgot. You go next. Yeah.
Basically, well, two things. First, again, George spoke to his last comment exactly what was on my mind in terms of something very important out of this reading, namely the public debt and the tax policy. That's something I'm going to look at again and again because particularly in this country, how that contradiction is resolved. Right now on the surface, it appears that they're shifting things in terms of enormous cuts to decisions in terms of Medicaid and Medicare in order to finance the repressive apparatus for deportations, which essentially attacks on the working class, and the military budget. But the other thing I want to speak to was a point raised, 2 points raised by Jeff earlier. One, which I definitely agree with, and that's the whole question of power. The role of power in terms of how these struggles manifest themselves, that the decisive component there is power. Who can exercise the power? I mean, who can wield the power to exercise their will? But the other point that I thought was very instructive for the readings, and I can't check it for me, and Jeff raised this too, was the comparison between England and France economically. I think that's extremely important in understanding the course of the class struggle in France. France was decidedly behind England in terms of
squad, and Justin was not able.
I beg your pardon?
All right, there you go.
Was decidedly behind England in terms of development, and I think that. And the other point that Marx made in terms that I thought was decisive for the whole point of how that the dominant economic force of France at the time was agriculture, which obviously lags behind industry. An instructive piece on this, and it made me when I read it, I thought about it and revisited it, was an article Marx wrote, I know it's part of the Grundrisse, namely the article Bastiat and Carey, where he makes a similar point about in criticizing Bastiat's characterization. I know, but I just raised that as a reference because I think it ties into the point that Marx is making here, how the economic factor was determinant in terms of the limits and possibility of the class struggle. Finally, somebody made a point earlier I thought was very important, but I can't think of it right now. It'll come back to me later. That's it.
John, and then Cynthia.
Yeah, just on Jeff's point about 1848 in Britain, I mean, he's got it completely wrong. I mean, he did talk about the 1848 Chartist petition. It's huge. I mean, this was the largest of the petitions to Parliament, and the demonstration and so forth, and the panic of the ruling classes, um, mobilization of the army, recruitment of special constables, including, incidentally, Louis Bonaparte at that point in exile in Britain, volunteered as a special constable for the to control the demonstration, which was held. I mean, it's actually the other thing about it is that it was the first time ever that photographs have been taken of a mass demonstration, and they're really, really impressive and sort of a superb, huge demonstration. But the thing about the repression is it wasn't that they all went home, because they didn't. I mean, that's just not what happened. What happened was the repression, the mobilization of the army, the police force, and so on and so forth, actually prevented the demonstration from crossing the Thames. So it kept it on the south side of the Thames. And for those of you who don't know the geography of London, the government buildings are all on the north side, or they were then. So Parliament was on the north side of the Thames, and they just didn't get there, and so forth. So the demonstration was kept away from the thing, and it broke up without being effective. I mean, before the demonstration, there'd been a Chartist convention held, huge one, which the police had then broken up, and it had to be shifted to Birmingham. So unlike in France, the sort of the potentially revolutionary section of the working class was not meeting in the capital, which I think, this sort of thing does have an effect. But the other thing is, after the demonstration was broken up, there was then an attempt at an uprising, which was broken by the intelligence services of the government and so forth. And various leaders were arrested, transported, effectively sent into exile, and so forth. I mean, Coffey, the black leader of London Chartism, was deported to Tasmania, where he played a significant role in founding the Tasmanian labour movement. So all was perhaps not lost. Sorry?
There were no revolutionary disturbances in Britain for whatever reason.
I mean, he was fighting for workers' rights. So he kept up his contribution. When he was allowed to come back, he didn't come back. He stayed in Tasmania. Anyway, so but the point about the 1850s was this was a period of repression right across Europe. I mean, this is a period of repression in France, in Britain, whatever. The other crucial thing, of course, about the difference between Britain was at this point the only capitalist country in Europe. I mean, the thing about the French Revolution of 1848 was it was a bourgeois revolution. They had already had a bourgeois revolution, but this is a revolution. But the bourgeois revolution in France, as Ellen Mixon Woods points out, wasn't a capitalist revolution. The capitalist revolution in France was 1848. So this was when the bourgeoisie was revolution. I mean, Marx is going on about it. This is what we've been reading about. In Britain, the bourgeoisie was already in power. I mean, this is the point about this comparison he makes between them. It doesn't come out as crudely as I've just done, but I mean that's effectively what it is. The bourgeoisie was in power, and therefore the bourgeoisie was not a revolutionary class. The bourgeoisie was a conservative class in Britain. So when you had the working class upsurge in 1848, it was the working class on its own, and of course Britain did not have or at least England did not have a dispossessed peasantry. Scotland did, but and Ireland did, of course, but they're slightly different, and situations slightly different there. So that's that is very much the situation of Britain. As far as Craig's thing about was the peasantry revolutionary in France. Well, the point in France in 1848 was no, they weren't, because they'd had their revolution in 1789. They'd got their land, and it was about the encroachment of capitalism onto their land, and them defending themselves against it. And that was why they voted for Bonaparte. But of course, Bonaparte did not stand as representative of class. Bonaparte stood as a representative of himself. This is I mean, looking at Bonaparte and his relationship to all these things gives you some sort of insight into the relationship between the ambitious politician who wants power for whatever reason, for their own personal reasons, and at the same time how it all relates to the class struggle and so forth. And we'll come more to that in the 18th Brumaire, which is a very, very interesting historical question, and one that perhaps the vulgar Marxists don't pay enough attention
to. Sean, Cynthia.
Okay, I'll be brief. Yeah, thank you, John, for saying that about Bonaparte not representing, but representing himself, not a class. It does seem like that. We could say that about Trump also. I mean, he is a billionaire, but he does not act in the interests of his class as such. He acts in the interest of himself and his family members and a coterie of people. So how to analyze what's happening in the United States cannot be done through Trump, in my opinion. You need to know it, but you don't. But I do want to just thank George so much for speaking to this question of the relationship between debt, the political activities of repression, the necessity of the complexities of the relationship of debt in understanding the difference between the interests of the industrial bourgeoisie and the financial aristocracy, and what that means in terms of the state. I really appreciate the way that was presented and explained, and it, to me, it's probably a very good framework for looking at what's happening in the United States, because one of the things we haven't talked about and needs to be understood much better than we do is the differences between the interests of the financial, not aristocracy, but institutions, the financial powers, and the industrial section of the bourgeoisie. They get conflated in this country, but I mean, how do you say, objectively, their interests are not necessarily aligned. So anyway, something for us to be looking at as we move forward. Thank you all. Been excellent.
Thank you, Cynthia. I might leave. That was a very rich discussion on lots of points there. Given that we're 2 minutes to 1, I might wind it up. Thanks, everyone. And we go on to part 4 next week. So I'll see you then.
Okay. Thank you all.